Keep back! Stop them! Not another step!
The shuttle moved silently through the darkness of space. Through the wide viewing window, hundreds of stars stretched across the black sky like tiny lights scattered across an endless ocean. Most of the passengers sat quietly, thinking about the future waiting for them. Among them was a young human cadet. This was not just another school. It was the largest military academy in the known galaxy. Every year, students from dozens of worlds traveled there to learn leadership, survival, engineering, and advanced combat training. Only the best were accepted. The human cadet had worked for years to earn a place there. As the shuttle approached the station, the massive academy slowly came into view. It was far larger than anything he had ever seen before. Huge rings surrounded the central structure. Hundreds of ships moved around it like tiny insects. Bright lights covered the station from end to end. Several alien passengers looked out the window with excitement. First time? One of them asked. The human nodded. The alien smiled. You'll never forget your first day. A few minutes later, the shuttle docked. The passengers stepped into a crowded arrival hall. Different species filled every corner. Some were tall and thin. Others were short and heavily built. Some had scales while others had fur. The academy brought together students from worlds that were completely different from each other. The human quickly noticed something. Many of the alien cadets looked stronger than him. Some stood nearly twice his height. Others had arms thicker than his legs. A few could probably lift heavy machinery without much effort. He had expected this. Humans were still relatively new to the larger galactic community. Many species viewed them as average in almost every category. Not weak, but not exceptional either. The human did not mind. He had learned long ago that people often judge too quickly. The orientation process lasted most of the day. Groups of new cadets were guided through training areas, living quarters, classrooms, simulation chambers, and massive hangars filled with military equipment. Everywhere they went, instructors explained the academy's rules. Discipline, respect, teamwork, adaptability. The instructors repeated these words constantly. By evening, the new cadets were exhausted. The human settled into his assigned room and looked out at the stars beyond the station. Tomorrow would be the first real training day. He had no idea that his life was about to change. The next morning began early. A loud announcement echoed through the dormitory halls before sunrise. Cadets rushed to prepare themselves. Within minutes, hundreds of students were moving toward their assigned training areas. The human followed his group through a series of corridors until they arrived at a massive weapons training complex. The room was enormous. Rows of targets stretched across the far wall. Training platforms filled the center. Display screens covered every available surface. The atmosphere felt serious. This was where future officers learned how to handle military equipment under pressure. The cadets took their positions while waiting for the instructor. Conversations filled the room. Many students were excited. Weapons training was one of the academy's most popular subjects. A few moments later, the main doors opened. The instructor entered. He was a towering alien veteran with decades of military experience. His uniform carried numerous service markings, showing years of achievement. The room immediately became silent. The instructor looked around at the gathered cadets. "Welcome," he said in a firm voice. Nobody spoke. "You are here because your governments believe you have potential. Over the next several years, that potential will be tested." He slowly walked across the training floor. "Some of you think you are strong." A few students straightened proudly. The instructor noticed. A small smile appeared on his face. "By the end of this course, you will discover how little strength actually matters without discipline." The cadets listened carefully. The instructor spent the next hour explaining safety procedures and weapon classifications. Everything seemed normal. Then something changed. A large transport platform entered through a side doorway. The machine carried a long metal container unlike anything the cadets had seen before. Immediately, several older instructors turned their attention toward it. Even they seemed curious. The platform stopped in the center of the room. The container was carefully lowered onto a reinforced stand. The instructor folded his arms. "Today," he said, "you will see a piece of military history." The room became completely quiet. The container slowly opened. Inside rested a massive rifle. The weapon looked ancient compared to modern equipment. Its metal surface carried marks from decades of use. The barrel was unusually thick. The stock looked solid enough to survive almost anything. Most importantly, it was huge, far larger than a normal rifle. Several cadets stared in surprise. One raised a hand. "Is that real?" The instructor nodded. "Very real." Another student leaned forward. "Who used it?" The instructor smiled. "An elite combat unit from a distant world." He paused for dramatic effect. The weapon became famous because very few individuals could operate it effectively. The room filled with whispers. The instructor pointed toward the rifle. This weapon earned a reputation across multiple military campaigns. A cadet near the front asked, "Why stop using it?" The instructor laughed softly. "Because technology improved." A few students nodded. Then the instructor added something unexpected. "But even today, most people cannot properly lift it." The room suddenly became interested. Several cadets exchanged doubtful looks. The instructor noticed. "You think I'm exaggerating?" No one answered. "Good." He stepped beside the rifle. This weapon was designed under very unusual conditions. The materials used in its construction make it significantly heavier than modern combat rifles. One cadet stood. "I can lift it." Laughter spread through the room. The instructor gestured toward the rifle. "Go ahead." The cadet confidently approached. He looked strong, very strong. Several students expected him to succeed easily. He grabbed the rifle, pulled. Nothing happened. His expression changed. He adjusted his grip and tried again. This time the weapon moved slightly. The cadet strained harder. Finally, he managed to raise one end several centimeters before setting it back down. His face turned red. The room grew quiet. The instructor said nothing. The cadet slowly returned to his place. Another student volunteered. Then another. Then another. Each attempt ended the same way. Some managed to move the rifle slightly. Others barely moved it at all. One particularly large cadet was certain he would succeed. Instead, he nearly lost his balance. The room erupted with surprised reactions. The human watched quietly from the back. He was not focused on the students. He was studying the rifle. Something about it seemed interesting. As more cadets attempted the challenge, the instructor continued watching with calm confidence. Nearly an hour passed. No one successfully lifted the weapon. The mood in the room changed. At first, students had viewed the challenge as a joke. Now they were beginning to understand. The rifle was genuinely difficult to handle. Eventually, the instructor stepped forward. "I believe the point has been demonstrated." Nobody argued. He rested one hand on the weapon. "Strength alone is not enough." Several students looked disappointed. The instructor continued. "Across many academies, this rifle has become a tradition." He looked around the room. Every year, someone believes they can succeed. The cadets listened carefully. Every year they fail. A few nervous laughs followed. The instructor smiled. Then his eyes moved toward the human section of the class. His expression became playful. "Perhaps," he said, "one of our human cadets would like to try." Laughter immediately spread through the room. Not cruel laughter. More the kind that followed an impossible suggestion. Many students glanced toward the humans. Most of them simply smiled awkwardly. The instructor chuckled. "I didn't think so." But before he could continue, a chair moved. The sound was small, yet somehow everyone noticed. The laughter slowly faded. Heads turned. The human cadet stood up. For a moment, nobody spoke. The instructor raised an eyebrow. The room became completely silent. Dozens of eyes focused on the young human. The instructor studied him carefully. "You wish to attempt it?" The human remained calm. "Yes, instructor." A few students exchanged surprised looks. Others shook their heads. Some looked excited. The instructor stared at him for several seconds. Then a slow smile appeared. Very well. The entire room watched as the human stepped away from his position and began walking toward the massive rifle waiting at the center of the training floor. With every step, the silence grew heavier. Nobody knew what was about to happen. But suddenly, everyone wanted to find out. The room stayed silent as the human cadet walked forward. Every step echoed slightly on the metal floor of the training hall. It was not loud, but in the silence it felt heavier than it really was. Hundreds of eyes followed him. Some students leaned forward in their seats without even realizing it. Others crossed their arms, waiting to see what kind of mistake was about to happen. The alien instructor stood near the massive rifle, watching carefully. He had seen many cadets attempt challenges like this before. Some tried to show strength. Some tried to impress others. Some simply underestimated the weapon. In the end, all of them learned the same lesson. This human was different only in one way. He had actually agreed to try. The human stopped a few steps away from the rifle. Up close, the weapon looked even larger than it had from a distance. The metal frame was thick and worn, with scratches that suggested years of heavy use. The barrel was long and heavy, designed for power rather than comfort. Even the stand beneath it was reinforced to prevent damage to the floor. The human did not rush. He looked at the rifle carefully, not like someone trying to prove something, but like someone trying to understand it. That small detail made a few students exchange quiet glances. Most cadets who failed earlier had grabbed the weapon immediately, relying on strength alone. They pulled, lifted, strained, and gave up quickly. But this human was simply observing at first. The instructor noticed too, but said nothing. Finally, the human stepped closer. He placed one hand lightly on the rifle's frame. Then he paused again. It was not hesitation out of fear. It looked more like calculation, as if he was measuring weight, balance, and position in his mind. A few students in the back whispered, "He's going to drop it the moment he lifts it. Humans don't have that kind of strength. Maybe he just wants attention." The instructor raised one hand slightly. The whispers stopped. The human adjusted his stance. He placed his feet in a balanced position, slightly apart. His shoulders relaxed instead of tightening. His breathing remained steady. Then he placed both hands on the rifle. The room leaned in without realizing it. For a moment, nothing happened. The human did not pull. He did not strain. He simply held it. Then, slowly, he began to lift. At first, the movement was almost invisible. The rifle shifted slightly, no more than a few centimeters. But it was enough. A few cadets blinked, unsure if they had actually seen it move. The instructor's eyes narrowed slightly. The human adjusted his grip. Then he lifted again. This time, the rifle rose higher. The metal frame creaked softly as weight shifted. The stand beneath it remained steady, but the weapon was clearly no longer fully resting on it. A wave of surprise moved through the room. The human continued lifting until the rifle was fully off the stand. For a moment, he held it at waist height. The room became so quiet it felt unnatural. Even the distant hum of the station outside seemed to fade. The human looked at the rifle in his hands, as if checking balance. Then he shifted it slightly. The movement was smooth, controlled, almost careful. The instructor took a slow step forward. "This is impossible," one student whispered. Another shook their head. "No one lifted it like that before." A third added, "Even the strongest ones struggled just to raise it." The human did not respond to any of it. He adjusted his grip again. The rifle was heavy. That much was obvious. Even for him, it was not light. But it was not uncontrollable either. He had handled heavier training equipment before in simulations. He had also trained under higher gravity conditions than most people in the room could imagine. For him, strength was not just about force. It was about control. The instructor finally spoke. "Place it down slowly," he said in a firm voice. "Do not attempt anything reckless." The human nodded slightly. Then, instead of placing it down, he raised it a little higher. The movement caused a ripple of tension across the room. Some cadets shifted in their seats. Others sat completely still. The instructor's expression changed slightly. It was no longer casual. It was focused now. The human brought the rifle up into a shoulder position. It looked unnatural at first, like something too large for a single person to handle comfortably. But after a few seconds, the position stabilized. The weapon was steady. The human's body adjusted naturally, aligning with the weight instead of resisting it. One of the senior instructors at the side leaned forward. "That stance," he muttered quietly. The main instructor heard him but did not respond. The human turned slightly toward the target wall. Rows of circular targets were set at different distances. Some were close. Some were far enough that even advanced cadets struggled to hit them consistently. The human focused on the farthest one. The room seemed to hold its breath. The instructor raised a hand. "One shot only," he said firmly. "This is a test of handling, not demonstration." The human gave a small nod again. He placed his finger near the trigger. A few cadets closed their eyes, expecting failure or possibly a misfire. The instructor stood completely still. Then the shot fired. The sound was enormous. It echoed through the entire hall, shaking the walls slightly. The recoil should have thrown the shooter backward. That was what usually happened. But the human barely moved. His stance absorbed the force cleanly. The rifle remained stable. A moment of silence followed the shot. Everyone looked at the target wall. For a second, nothing seemed different. Then the display system updated. The first shot had hit near the center of the farthest target. A few cadets blinked. Someone whispered, "That's not possible." The instructor stared at the result. He did not speak immediately. The human lowered the rifle slightly, still holding it one-handed for a moment as if confirming stability. Then he adjusted again. Without waiting for instruction, he fired a second shot. Another loud blast filled the hall. The recoil hit again. Still no visible struggle from the human. The second shot landed even closer to the center. Now the room reacted. Gasps spread across the cadets. Some stood slightly from their seats. Others leaned forward with shocked expressions. The instructor's eyes remained fixed on the target system. A third shot followed quickly. Then a fourth. The rhythm was steady, controlled. No hesitation. Each shot echoed through the hall like a strike of heavy metal. And each shot hit closer to the center than the last. The silence that followed each impact grew heavier each time. It was no longer disbelief. It was confusion, then concern, then something closer to respect. A cadet near the back whispered, "He's correcting a mid-shot." Another replied, "That rifle shouldn't even stay steady in one hand." The instructor finally stepped closer to the firing line. He watched carefully. The human was not struggling, not shaking, not forcing control. He was adapting, like the weapon was not something foreign, but something he had trained with for a long time. After the fifth shot, the instructor raised his voice. "Stop!" The human paused immediately. The room went quiet again. The instructor walked a few steps closer, his eyes moving between the rifle and the cadet. "You were instructed to fire one shot." The human remained calm. "I understand." Pause followed. The instructor studied him carefully. There was no arrogance in the response. No challenge. No defiance. Just calm acceptance. That made it harder to judge. The instructor looked back at the target display. 5 shots, all grouped tightly near the center. Not random hits. Controlled accuracy. Deliberate adjustment between each shot. He had seen expert soldiers struggle to achieve that level of grouping even with standard weapons. And this was not a standard weapon. The instructor slowly exhaled. "You will continue under supervision," he said finally. A few cadets exchanged stunned looks. The human simply nodded again. He raised the rifle once more. This time both hands were used. But his grip looked different now. More confident. More stable. As if something had shifted. As if the weapon had stopped being an obstacle and started becoming an extension of control. The instructor watched closely. He did not interrupt. Not yet. Because now, even he wanted to see what would happen next. The training hall did not feel the same anymore. After the first few shots, something had changed in the air. It was not just surprise. It was a deeper feeling, like the room itself had become more serious. Students who were laughing earlier were now completely quiet. Even those who were confident before now looked uncertain. The human cadet stood still near the firing line, holding the heavy rifle. The instructor watched him carefully. No one spoke for several seconds. Then, from the side entrance, the doors opened again. This time, more people entered the hall. They were not students. They were senior staff members from the academy. Some wore different uniforms, marked with higher ranks. A few were engineers from the weapons division. Others were training supervisors who normally did not attend beginner sessions. Their arrival changed the atmosphere again. Now it felt official. One of the senior instructors spoke quietly to the main instructor. "We received reports," he said, "about unusual performance with a classified weapon." The main instructor did not take his eyes off the cadet. "Yes," he replied simply. The senior group stepped closer to the observation area. The cadets in the room shifted nervously. It was rare for so many high-ranking staff to come to a basic training session. Something important was clearly happening. The human remained focused on the rifle. He did not look around. He did not react to the new arrivals. He simply adjusted his stance slightly, checking balance again. The main instructor finally spoke to the cadet. "You will continue," he said, "but under observation." The human nodded once. A few cadets whispered to each other. "This is getting serious. Why are the senior staff here? I think something is wrong with the weapon." The engineers moved closer to the rifle stand. One of them examined the device carefully. "It should not be possible," he muttered. "This model has a recoil system designed for multi-user stabilization." Another engineer checked the data panel connected to the weapon. "Energy output is normal," she said. "No malfunction detected." That comment made several heads turn. If the weapon was not broken, then the performance they had just seen was real. The human shifted his grip again. The rifle felt heavy, but manageable. He was not thinking about the crowd anymore. His focus had narrowed. For him, this was just another controlled exercise. One step at a time. One shot at a time. The main instructor raised his hand slightly. "Continue," he said. The human aimed at the target wall again. The farthest target was still marked from earlier shots. Now there was a small cluster near the center. He focused on it. A quiet tension filled the hall. Then the next shot fired. The sound echoed sharply again. The recoil pushed slightly harder this time, but the human controlled it without visible struggle. The shot landed. Another near-center impact. The engineers exchanged looks. "That grouping is too tight," one of them said. "It's improving with each shot," another replied. The human fired again. Then again. The rhythm was steady. Not rushed. Not random. Each shot was measured. Each movement controlled. It was not just strength anymore. It was accuracy combined with stability. Something that should not have been possible with that weapon in a single hand. A senior officer stepped forward slightly. "How is he compensating for recoil so precisely?" he asked quietly. No one answered immediately, because no one fully understood. The human continued firing. Shot after shot. The group on the target became tighter, almost unnaturally precise. After the seventh shot, one of the cadets stood up slightly from their seat. "He's doing it one-handed," the cadet whispered. Another responded, "That rifle is supposed to require a support rig." The instructor finally raised his hand again. "Stop after 10 shots," he ordered. The human did not respond verbally. He simply continued. 8, 9. Each shot clean. Each impact close to the exact center. The engineers were now fully focused. One of them spoke urgently. "This isn't just strength," she said. "He is adjusting micro-angle corrections between shots." Another replied, "That level of control should be impossible without a stabilization system." The final shot came. 10 shots total. The hall went completely silent again. Everyone looked at the target display. 10 impacts. all grouped tightly, almost forming a single point. Dead center was marked clearly. For a few seconds, no one reacted. It was as if the system needed time to confirm what had just happened. Then the display refreshed again. Confirmed results. Perfect grouping. A low murmur spread through the room. Some cadets shook their heads slowly. Others just stared. One of them whispered, "That's not training level. That's elite marksman level." Another replied, "No elite marksman uses that weapon one-handed." The main instructor stepped closer to the firing line. He looked at the cadet, then at the rifle, then at the target again. He was trying to understand what he had just seen. The human slowly lowered the rifle, still holding it carefully, not tired, not shaking, just steady. The engineers approached the weapon stand again. One of them carefully checked the rifle structure. "It's intact," he confirmed. "No stress damage?" "None." That answer made the situation even more confusing. If the weapon was functioning normally, then the performance was entirely due to the cadet. The senior officer turned to the main instructor. "This is not standard human capability," he said. The instructor replied calmly, "I did not expect standard results." The officer looked back at the cadet. "What is your training background?" he asked. The human paused briefly, then replied in a calm voice, "Basic academy preparation." Nothing unusual. That answer caused a few raised eyebrows among the staff. One of the engineers spoke again. "Then how did you control recoil like that?" The human looked at the rifle for a moment. "I adjusted with timing," he said simply. "The recoil pattern repeats. It becomes predictable." The explanation sounded too simple for what they had just witnessed. The engineer frowned. "That weapon does not have a predictable recoil pattern under single-hand use," she said. The human did not argue. He just stayed silent. The instructor watched this exchange carefully. There was something unusual about the cadet's calmness. Not arrogance, not pride, just simple acceptance of what he could do. That made it harder to judge him, because nothing about his behavior matched what they expected. A senior officer stepped forward again. "We need to run controlled tests," he said. The instructor nodded slowly. "Yes," he agreed. But before they could continue, one of the cadets spoke from the back. "Is he even allowed to do that?" The room turned slightly toward the voice. The cadet continued, "No one else could even lift it properly, but he fired 10 shots like it was nothing." The tension in the room shifted again. Now it was not just surprise. It was uncertainty. The instructor raised his voice slightly. "Silence." The room went quiet again. He looked at the cadet. "You will remain here for further evaluation." The human nodded once. Still calm, still steady. He placed the rifle back onto the stand carefully. As soon as he released it, the weight settled back into the reinforced base. The engineers immediately surrounded the weapon again, checking every detail. But nothing was wrong. No faults, no changes. Only performance that should not have been possible. The senior officer stepped closer to the instructor. "This will be reported to Central Command," he said quietly. The instructor nodded. "Yes," he replied. The cadets in the hall remained silent. Many of them were still trying to process what they had just seen. A few were now looking at the human differently, not as someone weaker, not as someone average, but as something they did not fully understand yet. The human stood quietly at the firing line, waiting, not knowing that what had just happened was only the beginning of something much larger than a simple training exercise. The training hall remained unusually quiet even after the shots had ended. The rifle was now back on its reinforced stand, but nobody seemed to relax. The cadets were still sitting in their places, looking at the target wall, then at the weapon, then at the human cadet standing near the firing line. It felt like the room was waiting for something else to happen. The senior staff had not left. In fact, more had arrived. Now there were multiple instructors, engineers, and academy officers standing along the side observation area. Some were speaking quietly into communication devices. Others were reviewing data from the weapon system. The main instructor stood with his arms folded, his eyes fixed on the cadet. The human remained calm. He did not move unnecessarily. He did not speak. He simply stood there, waiting for instructions like any other cadet. But the atmosphere around him had completely changed. Before, he was just another student in the room. Now, he was the center of attention. One of the engineers spoke quietly to a senior officer. "All weapon readings are normal," she said. "No modifications, no malfunctions, no external assistance." The officer frowned slightly. "So you are saying a single cadet controlled that output on his own?" "Yes," she replied after a pause. The officer did not respond immediately. He looked toward the firing line again. That answer did not satisfy him. Not because it was incorrect, but because it did not fit expectations. The main instructor finally stepped forward. "We will conduct a controlled verification test," he announced. The cadets straightened in their seats. A verification test was not a normal part of training. It usually meant something had to be proven beyond doubt. The instructor continued. "There are claims of unusual control and handling with a high-mass weapon. We will test those claims directly." The human nodded slightly. The instructor turned toward him. "You will follow instructions exactly." "Yes, instructor," the human replied. The officer from the senior group stepped closer. "This is no longer standard training," he said. "This is evaluation." The human did not react emotionally. He simply listened. The instructor gestured toward the weapon. "First test. Lift and hold." The cadets leaned forward slightly. The instruction sounded simple, but after what they had already seen, everyone knew it was not simple at all. The human walked toward the rifle again. The hall was silent except for the soft sound of footsteps. When he reached the weapon stand, he placed both hands on the rifle. For a moment, he did not lift it. It was the same calm behavior as before. No rush, no struggle. Then he lifted it. The rifle rose smoothly. No shaking, no imbalance. The engineers immediately watched the readings on their devices. "Weight distribution stable," one of them muttered. The human held the rifle at chest level. The instructor observed carefully. "Hold position for 10 seconds, he said. The human did not move. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds. The rifle remained steady in his hands. No visible strain, no adjustment needed. Some cadets whispered quietly again. "He's holding it like it's standard equipment. That thing was impossible to lift earlier." At 10 seconds, the instructor raised his hand. "Set it down." The human lowered the rifle slowly and placed it back onto the stand with controlled precision. The engineers immediately checked the base. No impact damage. No instability. The officer nodded slightly. "Next test," the instructor said. A holographic display activated near the target wall. New target patterns appeared, more complex than before. Smaller circles, moving sections, variable distances. The instructor spoke. "Accuracy test. 10 shots. Full control. No assistance." The human stepped back into position. He checked the rifle briefly, then lifted it again. The room became silent once more. Even the engineers stopped speaking. The instructor raised his hand. "Begin." The first shot fired. The sound echoed through the hall. The recoil was absorbed cleanly. The shot hit the moving target. Dead center. A few cadets blinked. The target moved again. Second shot. Another hit. Perfect timing. The human adjusted slightly between shots. Not dramatically, just small movements, like corrections that came naturally. Third shot. Fourth. Fifth. Each one followed the moving target pattern. Each one landed accurately. The engineers began watching more closely. "This is reaction-based adjustment," one said. "But the timing gap is too small," another replied. "Human reflex data doesn't support that consistency." The instructor did not speak. He only watched. The human continued firing. Sixth shot. Seventh. The moving targets increased speed. The pattern became more complex. The cadet did not slow down. He adjusted, step by step, shot by shot. Eighth shot. Still accurate. Ninth shot. A perfect center hit on a target that changed direction mid-cycle. The room reacted with quiet shock. Even the senior officer raised his eyebrows slightly. The final shot came. 10th. The target shifted sharply at the last moment. The human adjusted instantly. The shot landed directly in the center again. Silence followed. No one spoke immediately. The display froze for a moment as if processing the result. Then confirmed all 10 hits. Perfect accuracy under movement conditions. The instructor slowly lowered his hand. The test was complete, but no one seemed satisfied yet, because what they had just seen was not normal performance. It was consistency under pressure that did not match expected human limits. The senior officer finally stepped forward. "This is not just strength," he said. "It is adaptation." The engineer beside him nodded slowly. "He is predicting movement patterns faster than expected neural response rates." Another engineer added, "Or he is not predicting at all. He is reacting instantly." The officer looked at the human. "Explain your timing," he asked. The human paused for a moment, then answered simply, "The target's repeat behavior patterns. Once you observe enough cycles, movement becomes predictable." The engineers exchanged looks again. "That level of observation still requires extended processing time," one said quietly. The human did not respond further. He stood calmly. The instructor stepped closer. "You will now perform a final test," he said. The cadets looked around. "Another test?" The instructor pointed toward the rifle. One-handed firing sequence. A small wave of tension spread through the room again. The earlier shots had already proven control, but one-handed firing under moving target conditions was different. Much more unstable. Much more difficult. The human did not question it. He simply adjusted his stance, then lifted the rifle with one hand. The weapon shifted slightly at first, but he corrected immediately. The engineers leaned forward again. "Stability correction happening instantly," one whispered. The instructor raised his hand. 5 shots. The human aimed. Fired. First shot hit center. Second shot followed quickly. Then third. The rifle remained steady. Even one-handed, there was no visible struggle. Fourth shot. Fifth shot. All hits confirmed. All accurate. The hall stayed silent again. Not because nothing had happened, but because too much had happened too quickly for anyone to process it properly. The instructor slowly lowered his arm. The test was finished. For now. The senior officer looked at the data feed again. Then at the cadet. "This level of control is not typical for any standard recruit group," he said quietly. The instructor nodded slightly. "I agree." The human lowered the rifle and stepped back. Still calm. Still steady. But now everything around him had changed. The cadets were no longer just watching a training exercise. They were watching something they did not fully understand yet. And the academy staff had already started realizing the same thing. This was no longer about a rifle. It was about the person holding it. The testing hall was no longer treated like a normal training area. After the final shots, the atmosphere had changed completely. The cadets were still present, but none of them were talking now. Even the ones who usually joked during training were sitting very still, as if afraid that any sound might break something important. The human cadet stood near the firing line while several academy staff gathered in quiet discussion a few steps away. The rifle remained on its stand, unchanged, silent, and heavy as ever. But it no longer felt like just a weapon. It felt like evidence. Senior officers, engineers, and instructors were all looking at it differently now. Not as a piece of equipment, but as something that had been used in a way they did not fully understand yet. One of the engineers spoke first. "We need to verify something," she said, looking at the weapon's internal readings again. "There is still no malfunction, no calibration error, no hidden assistance system activated." Another engineer nodded slowly. "I have checked it 3 times. The weapon performed exactly as designed." That statement made the situation even more confusing, because if the weapon was normal, then everything they had just seen had come from the cadet alone. The senior officer crossed his arms. "That level of control is not expected from a new cadet," he said. The main instructor stood nearby watching the human carefully. He had seen many strong recruits over the years. He had trained elite marksmen from different worlds. But what he had witnessed today did not fit into any of those experiences. Not even close. The human remained calm through it all. He was not celebrating. He was not reacting to attention. He simply waited. That calmness was starting to make the instructors even more curious. One of the senior officers stepped forward. "Tell me something," he said, speaking directly to the human. "Where did you learn to handle that weapon like that?" The hall became quiet again. The question was simple, but the weight behind it was not. The human looked at him for a moment, then answered. "Basic training," he said, "and controlled practice environments." The officer frowned slightly. "That does not explain the precision or stability you demonstrated." The human remained still. "I followed what the weapon allowed," he replied. That answer made a few engineers exchange looks again, because it sounded too simple for something so complex. The main instructor finally spoke. "Your performance today has triggered a full review," he said. The cadets shifted slightly in their seats. A full review was not common. It usually meant an official investigation or evaluation beyond normal training limits. The instructor continued. "You will remain under observation until further notice." The human nodded once, still calm, still unchanged. But the attention in the room had already moved beyond just curiosity. Now it was analysis. One of the engineers approached the rifle again. She carefully ran another scan while speaking quietly. "I want to check something else," she said. The senior officer looked at her. "What?" She hesitated slightly before replying. "Human strength baselines." A few people turned toward her. She continued. "We assume standard human recruits fall within a certain physical range. But what if this individual is not operating within standard baseline conditions?" The idea spread quietly through the group. The officer looked at the human again. "You are saying enhanced capability?" The engineer shook her head. "Not necessarily artificial enhancement. Could be environmental adaptation, or training under different physical conditions." The main instructor listened carefully. "That would explain control," he said slowly. "But not that level of recoil stability." The engineer nodded. "Exactly." The human stood quietly nearby, listening but not interrupting. He was used to evaluations. He had been through many tests before joining the academy. But this felt different. Not because of difficulty, because of attention. The senior officer stepped closer to the instructors. "We need background verification," he said. "Complete physical history, training environment records, early development conditions." The instructor nodded. "That will be requested." One of the cadets in the back spoke quietly without raising their hand. "Is he in trouble?" The instructor turned his head slightly. "No," he said. "This is not punishment. This is assessment." The cadet lowered his gaze again. The human finally moved slightly, adjusting his stance. The weight of attention was not something he reacted to strongly, but it was still present. The engineers began discussing among themselves again. "There is something unusual about his handling technique," one said. "I noticed it too," another replied. "He doesn't fight the recoil. He redirects it." A third engineer added, "That should not be possible without external stabilization." The senior officer stepped closer to the group. "Can it be replicated?" he asked. The engineers paused. Then one of them answered carefully. "Not easily. Not with current cadet training models." The officer looked at the main instructor. "Then we have a problem," he said. The instructor did not respond immediately, because he knew what the officer meant. If one cadet could perform at this level without expected conditions, it meant their current understanding of capability limits might be incomplete. The human was still standing at the firing line. He had not moved much since the tests ended. But now, even the way he stood was being studied. One of the engineers approached closer to the weapon again. "This rifle was designed for multi-user operation support," she said. "It distributes recoil load across multiple stabilization systems." She paused. "But he handled it alone." without support systems, without assistance. She turned toward the human. How? The question was not hostile. It was genuine confusion. The human looked at the rifle for a moment before answering. It is just weight distribution, he said. Once you understand balance, the system becomes predictable. The engineer blinked slightly. That is an oversimplification, she replied. The human did not argue. He simply nodded. The senior officer turned to the instructor. I want full simulation replication, he said. The instructor nodded. Yes. The cadets watched silently as the staff continued discussing. For them, the day had already become something they would remember for a long time. Not because of failure, but because of what they had witnessed. One cadet whispered quietly to another. I thought only elite veterans could do things like that. The other replied softly. Maybe we were wrong. Meanwhile, the instructors continued their discussion. The main instructor finally spoke again. Regardless of explanation, he said, the results are clear. Everyone turned slightly toward him. He continued. The cadet demonstrated full control, stability, and accuracy under conditions that exceed standard entry-level expectations. The officer nodded. Yes. The instructor looked toward the human. That means he will need advanced classification. A brief silence followed. Advanced classification was not a normal step for new recruits. It meant specialized training paths, restricted access, and close monitoring. The officer agreed. Approved. The human remained still as the decision was made around him. No celebration, no reaction, just quiet acceptance. The engineers finished their final checks. We have all data recorded, one of them said. We will analyze it in full detail. The officer turned toward the cadets. This session is concluded, he announced. The students began to stand slowly. Some still looked back at the firing line. Some looked at the human cadet as they left. But none of them spoke loudly, because something about the moment felt too serious for normal conversation. As the hall began to clear, the instructor remained near the center. He looked at the human one more time. There was something in his expression now. Not confusion anymore. Not doubt. Something closer to respect mixed with caution. You will be called for further evaluation, he said. The human nodded. Yes, instructor. The instructor turned away slightly, but paused for a moment before leaving. The hall was still mostly quiet now. Only a few staff members remained. The human stood alone near the firing line. The rifle rested silently beside him. But the impact of what had happened there would not stay silent for long. Because even though the test was over, the real questions had just begun. The academy hall was quiet long after the training session ended. Most cadets had already left, but the memory of what happened stayed behind like a heavy shadow. Even the sound of footsteps felt different now, softer, more careful, as if everyone was still trying not to disturb something important. The human cadet was taken to a separate evaluation room. It was smaller than the training hall, but far more serious in feeling. The walls were plain, the lighting was bright, and there were observation panels built into the upper section of the room. Several senior officers were already inside. Some engineers were reviewing data streams on floating displays. Others were checking recorded performance logs from the rifle test. The main instructor stood near the center, waiting quietly. The human stood in front of them, calm, still, waiting for instructions again. The senior officer stepped forward first. This is no longer a training matter, he said. This is a capability assessment. The human gave a small nod. The officer studied him for a moment before continuing. Your performance has been recorded across multiple categories: strength handling, recoil control, reaction timing, and accuracy under dynamic conditions. He paused. All results are above expected baseline levels for new recruits. The room remained quiet. The human did not react. He simply listened. The officer continued. We need to understand how. That was the real question. Not what happened, but why it happened. An engineer activated a large display panel. It showed simulation data from the training session. Slow motion analysis of each shot, each adjustment, each recoil correction. Lines and graphs filled the screen. The engineer spoke while pointing. Here is the first shot. Notice the stabilization response. She zoomed in. The correction happens within milliseconds. That is faster than standard reflex prediction models. Another engineer added, and here the grip adjustment changes mid-recoil. That should normally cause imbalance. But the data showed something different. Perfect correction. Every time. The instructor watched quietly, arms still folded. The human stood in silence, observing the display but saying nothing. The officer turned back to him. You were not trained with this weapon before today? No, the human replied. Have you used similar systems? No. Pause followed. The officer frowned slightly. That makes the results harder to explain. The engineers continued reviewing data. One of them spoke slowly. We may be looking at natural adaptation ability. Another responded. That level of adaptation would require either extreme environmental training or unusual developmental conditions. The officer turned again. Tell us about your training environment. The human paused briefly, then answered. Standard academy preparation, physical conditioning, simulation drills, controlled environments. The engineer looked up. No exposure to high recoil systems? No. The room grew quiet again. The officer exhaled slowly. This does not match expected development curves. The instructor finally spoke. Then we must consider something else. Everyone turned toward him. He continued. Human baseline assumptions may not be accurate. The officer nodded slightly. That is one possibility. The engineer added, or this individual represents an outlier case. The human listened quietly to all of it. There was no confusion in his expression, only calm attention, like he was used to being analyzed. The officer stepped closer. We will run deeper scans, he said. Physical, neurological, and reflex mapping. The human nodded again. Understood. The engineer hesitated slightly before speaking. There is one more observation. The officer turned toward her. What is it? She looked at the data again. He never overcorrects. A few heads turned slightly. She continued. Most subjects, when exposed to high recoil systems, show instability. In adjustment, overcompensation, delayed correction, or fatigue drift. She pointed at the display. But his corrections are minimal and precise, almost like he is anticipating the system instead of reacting to it. The officer looked at the data closely. That would suggest predictive control, he said. Yes, she replied. The instructor added, or experience beyond recorded training. The officer looked back at the human. Explain your control method. The human thought for a moment, then answered simply, I observe movement patterns. Once repeated, they become predictable. The engineer frowned slightly. That explanation is too simple for the results we are seeing. The human did not respond further. The officer stepped back slightly. Record that statement, he said to the engineers. They confirmed. The data continued to be stored and analyzed. After a few moments, the officer changed tone. For now, we proceed with classification. The room became slightly more focused. This was the formal step. The instructor looked at him. What level? The officer replied. Advanced observation tier. A quiet pause followed. That meant the cadet would not be placed in normal training groups anymore. He would be monitored closely, assigned specialized drills, and reviewed continuously. The instructor nodded slowly. Approved. The human remained calm through all of it. No visible reaction. No emotion change. Just acceptance. The officer turned slightly. You will undergo controlled environment testing starting tomorrow. Yes, the human replied. Another engineer spoke. We will also integrate comparative simulations against elite cadet datasets. The officer nodded. Do it. The display screens shifted again. New charts appeared, comparing the human's performance with top academy marksmen from different species. The differences were visible, not in strength alone, but in stability under pressure, reaction consistency, and adaptation speed. One of the engineers spoke quietly. "This is not normal variance." The instructor replied. "It is not." The officer looked at the screen for a long moment, then spoke slowly. "Either we are observing an exceptional recruit," he paused, "or we are missing something fundamental about human capability." No one responded immediately, because both possibilities were serious. The human stood still as the analysis continued around him. He did not interrupt. He did not ask questions. He simply waited. That silence itself became part of the observation. The officer finally closed the display. "For now, this session is concluded." The engineers began saving final logs. The instructor looked at the human one last time. "There will be further tests," he said. The human nodded. "Yes, instructor." The officer turned toward the exit, but paused for a moment. He looked back. "There is one final note," he said. Everyone turned slightly. He continued. "Today's results will be shared with Central Command." The room became even quieter. That meant this was no longer just academy-level attention. It was moving higher, much higher. The officer left the room. The engineers followed shortly after. The instructor stayed a moment longer. Then he also turned toward the exit. Before leaving, he looked at the human again. His expression was different now. Not suspicion, not doubt, something closer to measured respect, but also caution, because whatever they had seen today did not fit neatly into their understanding. The room slowly emptied, until only the human remained inside. He stood alone in the center of the evaluation room. The bright lights reflected off the plain walls. The silence felt heavier than before. Outside, the academy continued its normal life. But inside the system, something had already shifted. Reports were being sent. Data was being analyzed. Comparisons were being made across multiple divisions. And somewhere beyond that room, decisions were already starting to form. About training, about classification, and about what this human cadet might become in the future. The human looked forward calmly, not aware of the full scale of what was coming next, but ready for whatever would follow, because for him this was not the end of a test. It was only the beginning of understanding where he truly stood.